Hi, thanks so much for coming. I'm Eric Rogers. I'm an alum of the school, and it's really nice to be here with in my old school with a bunch of Yale students here and Yale faculty here. It's really great, sort of the meeting of two worlds. I just graduated from there, and it's just really awesome. And my communal friends. So yeah, this is part of an Immanent Urbanism's series of lectures. It's one of our panels where we are going to be talking about communal housing, and that fits into the series basically because the series, as I mentioned earlier, is based around the ways in which everyday people are actually making what they will of the built environment despite design. So it's basically like the ways in which design thinking and reshaping the city is happening in the hands of like normal people who do not have design backgrounds. So yeah, this panel specifically is going to talk about communal housing and its various ways in which it confronts the existing built environment. There's a lot of us who have been doing the practice of creating communal housing in the existing built environment, despite the fact that architecture and planning have traditionally been somewhat against what we're doing. Like if you think about the built environment, it's very much designed for families and singles, especially the housing stock. And we've had to deal with that fact in creating communal housing maybe earlier than its time, like before its time. So yeah, we're going to be talking a bit about that and the ways in which perhaps it could be institutionalized, maybe some of the problems that come along with that. I just want to introduce with a bit of sort of theory getting into practice. So I was recently reading Michael Hart's introduction to this book called Radical Thought in Italy, and in it he talked about how most theorists today lack a movement, and that this moment in the 70s was perhaps in his mind the last point when theorists had a movement that they could theorize about, and today theorists don't have those movements. In many ways, I feel like this panel is going to address something which is quite the converse of that, which is it's sort of a movement without theorists, and we really want to like bring this conversation into academia. Like we are people who are doing this stuff in our everyday lives, and I think the diversity of opinions represented on it probably are indicative of the fact that like we don't have like a coherent theory that we are following. Like there's no like prescribed directions. We're sort of making it up as we go along, and I think some of the insights you're going to hear from us are based on that stuff. So yeah, I want to introduce the panelists now. So there's 6 of us. I'll be going first. You already know me. After me will be Jessy Kate Schingler. So I'm going to be talking basically about multi-household or multi-unit communes. And Jessy, I think, is going to be talking more about global networks of communes. So this project with the Embassy Network is basically a distributed co-living network. So she's going to be talking about that. After her, Creon Levit, who works at Planet Labs, and before that was at NASA. He's going to be talking about working on setting up and maintaining and living in these communities and basic insights that relate to that. After that, we have Emily Abruzzo from Yale University, who and also Abruzzo of Bodziak Architects, and she's going to be talking to us about, as a practicing architect and architectural educator, about the question, is less enough? 100,000 homes for San Francisco, so she'll be posing that question. After her, we have Zach Benfield from the Radical Fairy House movement, although I'm not sure he totally adopts that term, but it's the closest one I can give to his projects, and he's going to be talking about his own involvement in the creation of queer spaces. And after that, we will finish up with Jay Standish, who's a founder of Open Door, which is working to connect these sort of bottom-up commune social impulses with more top-down resources and dealing with things like architects, zoning typology, housing typology, development, and banks. So these are very pragmatic questions about how this type of social arrangement can be more institutionalized. So I'll just kick it off with my spiel. I'm calling it Communes Despite Architecture. So I come from a design background. I don't hate architecture or anything like that. In fact, I love it, but I'm also really interested in the ways in which normal people are doing things that we might be able to call architecture. And yeah, my interest in communal housing really came from a political place. I was actually a student here at CCA. I became very radical through the Occupy movement and the war and whatever. And I began to think more and more about like those basic units in society that were reproducing a specifically capitalist, power-laden, very top-down society. And the family was one of those things that I felt very critical of. And it led me to thinking with some very interesting Italian theorists about the autonomia movement, and they're playing with this idea that there's a whole shadow of domestic labor that actually maintains a capitalist system. That in the home you do the labor that the workplace can't remunerate, and that there should be political struggle over this thing. That a traditional workers' unit could not, or movement could not really deal with these like domestic alcoves. And so these in a way were sort of like seen as these pockets of communism that were actually good for a capitalist accumulation system by basically being accumulated back into the system constantly. And this is Silvia Federici, a very interesting Italian theorist who argues for what she calls revolution at point zero, the ways in which that domestic labor actually maintains a capitalist system, and how to think through these problems in a really, I think, rigorous way. I went on to Yale, where I wrote a thesis about the ways in which the home came to be in the United States. I'm reading Jacques Donzelot on policing of families, which is a really interesting historical example of what happened in France, but I really wanted to investigate what happened in the United States specifically, and I found this really bizarre organization, a Better Homes in America campaign. It was backed by the Department of Commerce, and Herbert Hoover was really involved with it, and basically it created these two channels of ways in which we were supposed to relate to the home, and they were gendered. They were built along gendered lines. So there were the school cottages for homemaking that girls would go to, and the boys would learn how to build boy-built houses. And this distinction between the home and the house is a really interesting one that I began to investigate. How is it that the home relates to the official economy? Like, if the home is about the informal economics of domestic labor, the house is about the formal economics of the capitalist economy. And the ways in which gender and norms around gender really play into this were very interesting to me. But anyway, what it leads to, essentially, in the United States, and by design, is a specific normative way to relate to the house and the home. Anyway, I see communes as potentially breaking out of this because they make possible this thing that you might call self-valorization. This is, again, an autonomia term, which is the notion that you can realize economic well-being outside of the monetary economy, and in a way perhaps that does not flow back into the economy. So achieving some amount of autonomy from a market economy is what interested me in the communal movement. Anyway, I'm really excited that architecture is starting to take these issues on, to think about this stuff. This is Family Planning, the latest issue of Harvard Design magazine. Really awesome issue. It's actually got a concluding interview with Michael Hart, who is a really interesting thinker who I was quoting earlier. So yeah, I'm very happy architecture is on board. On the other hand, I feel a bit nervous about architecture's involvement with communal living, because I think, as Manfredo Tafuri illustrated, there are limits to what architects and architecture can do. I'm not sure that we can solve this as like an architectural problem. And so, like, moving forward, I hope we can avoid what he described in that wonderful book, Architecture and Utopia, where he described the way in which architecture as the ideology of the plan is swept away by the reality of the plan, when the level of utopia having been superseded, the plan becomes an operative mechanism. The crisis of modern architecture begins in the very moment in which its natural consignee, large industrial capital, goes beyond the fundamental ideology, putting aside the superstructures. From that moment on, architectural ideology no longer has any purpose. And I feel like, while he's speaking about modern architecture, I feel like the same could be said about a lot of the things that architecture gets really excited about, and communes are not exempt from that. And so, while I'm really excited about the institutionalization of communes as a thing in everybody's lives. I'm also concerned about how it might re-territorialize back into traditional power structures and reinforce those. So yeah, I want to talk a bit about the communes that we have created despite architecture, that is prior to architecture being interested in our projects. And I'm going to talk about it by way of mentioning a project that I did in New Haven while I was in grad school there. So this is New Haven, Connecticut. I know a lot of you have just flown from there. It doesn't look like this right now. It's really snowy and freezing. But there's a really interesting set of laws that are sort of there to reinforce the family and sort of there to protect students from being exploited by landlords. But basically, it's illegal for more than 4 adults to dwell in the same unit without a permit and some institutional affiliation. And so all the housing stock has been totally divided up, despite the fact that there's nice big houses all over the place and big buildings. Every single big house basically is like divided into multiple flats. And so this was like the built reality that we were dealing with as a fledgling commune. And so we basically tried an experiment out, which is the split household, a household that spans multiple units. And so we basically signed a lease on these 3 different apartment buildings in the Worcester Square area. This is, these are on St. John Street and Chestnut Street, respectively. And we didn't have the whole buildings. We just have 1 unit in each one of them. It was based on basically what we could find on Craigslist. And we applied as different individuals. And we told our landlords some stuff, but not everything. I just want to say, not only were the laws and the physical buildings working against us, but like landlords are such a conservative pain, and like they're just a drag on progress, and like they're just part of the reality that you have to deal with a lot of the time, especially if you don't have enough money to buy your building. And so we gave some information. Anyway, what we did was, here's images of each of the buildings. So that's the Chestnut Street apartment, and then these are the 2 St. John apartments. Very common buildings. This wasn't like special circumstances, but we really wanted to see, like, can communes happen in a neighborhood like this in you know, semi-suburban New Haven? And it turns out that they can. What we did was we shared keys among ourselves. There was, we had 8 of us initially. It's actually grown since I've left to, I think it's 12 or 14 people now, which is really exciting. They've gotten another apartment, so now it's now 4 apartments. And yeah, we just share keys. We would share responsibilities for paying for and maintaining our commons. And our commons were pretty specific. They were spatial, they were food, and they were labor. And so you would cook dinner. It was understood you would cook dinner once every 2 weeks, and as a result of doing that, you would have warm dinner provided for you 4 nights a week. You would participate like collectively in like the social organization. That is, you would just show up and like be around and try to just like be part of that social unit. Like we really approached it as a household, like, and we saw each other as a household. And it's funny because people would always ask us, well, what makes it like different than just being roommates? And my feeling is that a lot made it different as roommates, and perhaps the most important thing that made it different is that we called it something else. We didn't call it roommates. We were a collective, we were a co-op, we were a commune, and we share things. And yeah, the material things we shared were food, space, and labor. And it's relatively unassuming from the outside. You wouldn't think that there's anything crazy going on in there, except for this little peek into the window of my former bedroom. And yeah, I just want to show you some images of our space. So it was like an attractive space. We'd like have guests over, and people would want to be in the space. And I think something about the tidiness of that space made it so that people wanted to be in it, which was really nice. We also tried to be just a little unconventional in sort of how our space was arranged, so that you would get some of the nourishment that you didn't get from what is New Haven, especially in the winter, which is really cold and dark and dreary. So we were really interested in like how we could rejuvenate each other, not only through like social interaction, but also through space. We had really wonderful dinners, home cooked dinners all the time, and dinner parties, which were a big fixture. We also had some exchange with, I was living part-time in a commune in San Francisco at the embassy, and we had some exchange with people from the embassy, and residents from New Haven would also visit the embassy in San Francisco. So there was like a nice exchange of people and culture between multiple communes. Yeah, this is just like casual time, watching movies or hanging out, eating cheese and crackers or whatever, dinners. And we even expanded to include many people who are outside of the community. So what's really exciting about the collective for me is that it's not just involving the people in your residence, that is your residence, but people like peripheral to the community. So these are two of the MED students. I think one or both of them are here right now, actually, studying in the commune, and we'd have people over for dinner, and it was cool how like this collective thing, it had clear boundaries in terms of who was a resident, but it was actually really blurry who was part of our community and who was not. Anyway, the thing you can see, I'm sort of talking about it from two different angles. On the one hand, there's like the strategy of, is it possible as an experiment? And on the other hand, I feel like there's like, I have like a real like warmth and like personal connection to like what we made possible there and what like became a reality, which is just this wonderful household of people who are mutually supportive and the efficiency of what we were doing too. Like it made the quality of all of our lives much, much higher. But if I can return a bit to the strategy, I'm really curious about like how we can make things that actually spread. Like how do we make things that can scale, that can be practiced everywhere? And I think this idea of the split household was a really important question for me because it means that you could basically do it anywhere. Like it didn't matter. Like our hardware was not so relevant as our sort of social software. Our sharing of the keys, our deciding to be a collective, our deciding that anyone in the collective could have access to any of the other apartments, and really like getting that clear from the very beginning. But I think there are other things, other considerations that other panelists are going to bring up. So yeah, if there's a software versus hardware question, there's also this question about what about suburbs? So like are communes possible in suburbs? I think this is a place that architecture maybe right now is not so interested in. Like what do we do about suburbia? There's a lot of emphasis on urban projects, but I think suburbia and also exurbs are a really good question. Also, there's a question of inequality that I really want to address. I'm sure you noticed that the group of people were at least not ethnically very diverse that were part of the commune, and I think it's a really tricky issue. I mean, we were pretty affordable, like we were not very expensive at all, but I don't know, I heard a really good thing by Simon Sadler where he was talking about the 60s and this attempt to like bring the communes and the Black Panthers together. It was really tricky because the hippies were trying to drop out of society. They wanted out of society. And the Black Panthers in a lot of ways, or at least many people who were represented by the Black Panthers, just wanted a seat at the table. And so I find often like when we're like, hey guys, let's like try this radical thing to people who feel like they're traditionally oppressed or not included. It's like they want inclusion. And this is like a tricky cultural thing that I think the commune movement needs to think about and address. Like, how do you make these things not feel like some marginal cop out of society? I'm not quite sure. Yes, this is this question of diversity. And so another I think strategy that I believe Jessy is going to talk about, so I won't talk about it too much, is how to connect multiple communes together. So if you can connect multiple households into one community, how do you create a larger community of connections so that you can use each other's resources or have support in other cities if you travel or move to other places? Like how can you set that kind of a thing up? And I guess I just want to end on these questions because they feel very unanswered to me, but I'm hoping some of our other panelists might have some stuff to say on them. But yeah, on that I'll turn it over to Jessy.
I'm Jessy Kate. Hello. So as Eric was saying, I'm involved with something that's called the Embassy Network. There's a whole bunch of people here who are also involved with the Embassy Network. We are a collective of people and spaces that are experimenting with culture and with commoning. And I'm going to go into a little bit of what that is, but that is primarily commoning with space, and it's primarily through co-living spaces. I have, just for some context, I have a couple of different hats that I wear within this network. One is that I've been involved with founding and setting up and finding the spaces for several of these individual spaces that are in the Bay Area, as well as we're currently working on a space in Berlin and in Nepal. And then I also do a lot of work at what we call the network level, so looking at designing processes, memberships between spaces, technology and tool development to support movement of people between these spaces. So kind of some of the hardware and the software layer, as Eric was referring to it. Again, for some context, our model, if you can call it that, is not prescriptive by any means. All the spaces in our network are independent and autonomous, but the vast majority of them have a few features in common. One of them is that they all have long and short-term accommodation. So we have people that are staying anywhere from one night through to many years and everything in between. And we have people who have memberships, so they'll come a certain number of nights a month. Then we have people who are maybe medium term, so they'll come to the Bay Area for several months, and then we won't see them again for a few years. So we really have this spectrum of uses of the space. We have each of our spaces has some form of collaborative governance. So these are not spaces that are services. You've probably heard of Common, or of WeWork is moving into WeLive. These are big co-working spaces, and I think co-living is following that kind of interesting pattern that's similar to co-working in the sense that you're going to have this, or you're seeing a proliferation of the spectrum where there's much more corporate spaces as well as much more community-run spaces, and ours are definitely on the community-run side of the spectrum. So we have shared governance in all of our spaces. And then finally, all of these spaces serve as platforms in one way or another. So they're not a finite or fixed set of uses of the physical space, but they exist to invite unexpected uses, and that plays a large role in the architectural, the way that architecture dovetails into our uses. We are really focused on new ways to share space. And so that, as Eric was saying, goes across the globe in terms of people coming in from out of town, but it also goes with our local neighborhood. So, for example, Zarina organizes lectures at the Victorian and at the Embassy that are really drawing people in off the street, talking about, like quantum physics and the upper hate, where we have, people, everything from physics professors to homeless individuals who are coming in to experience the talks that are going on there. Just for concreteness, the top picture there is the Red Victorian. It's a 20-room bed and breakfast co-living hotel, as we now call it. It has about 2,000 square feet of commercial space on the ground floor. And we do co-working there during the day. We have art gallery space. We have some maker space. We do events in the evenings. Sometimes we get a nonprofit liquor license, and we do bar events. All kinds of stuff. And then about 10 of the rooms are for long-term residents, about 10 for short-term, and some people are medium-term, and they kind of cross that divide. The bottom one is the Embassy, and that's about 10 rooms. Roughly 2 or 3 of them are short-term, and the rest are long-term. We have co-working there, we do events, we do dinners. And even like the number of rooms, for example, that are short versus long-term, it's not fixed. I can't say it's exactly this many, because depending on the month or the time of year, it will be fluid. So all of that is kind of setting some context to the provocation that I think Eric is really offering us, which is the ways in which we find that our use of space is really challenged by and offers a challenge to the normative city. And I see that there are two kind of patterns that really emerge from the ways that we use space and want to use space. One of them is what I would call inversions, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. And then the other is fluidity. So many of the different uses that we have involves fluidity in time and in space. So the first one of these is really going from what we would traditionally call multi-use, so something like a building that's got commercial on the ground floor and residential upstairs would be a multi-use building. But we actually have fluid and parallel uses. So at different times of day, you might be seeing people co-working versus hosting an event versus a fashion show versus a makerspace. But you also might have multiple of those uses happening at the same time. So that raises a lot of questions about what are we classified as, what building permits do we need, what zoning permits do we need. I think Jay's going to talk a lot more about that. But certainly it has challenged a lot of the city departments that we've tried to work with. We did some renovations at the Red Victorian, and there was sort of a comment down there about zoning. So just to go into that for a second, the Red Victorian is zoned as a bed and breakfast, as a small hotel with a commercial space, but we have a kitchen there that's for residential use. And when I went to talk to the Department of Public Health about our kitchen permit, and I said, well, the kitchen is meant to be used for for the housekeeper or the hotel manager. Well, we actually have a collective of 15 to 20 people who are all hotel managers. So can they all use the kitchen? And they were kind of like, I'm not really sure. And I think that they have really, they've tried really hard and they've worked with us a lot, and I really appreciate it, but there's certainly a lot of open questions that raises. The second is this idea of a spectrum, so going from public to private. Our spaces are, in a lot of ways, I think about them as the new community center. They're really a new type of public space. We have strangers in our house pretty much daily. I mean, the Red Victorian is physically open to the public. It's got a massive storefront on Haight Street that people just walk in from off the street and can co-work in. All the way through, if you go up to the third floor and to the back, you've got like a private resident lounge. And so there's questions about how we navigate the boundaries between those spaces. How does the architecture support us navigating those boundaries? And also without the architecture supporting that, or even with it, how do we kind of establish through the software layer those boundaries for ourselves? And how do we then make it, communicate it in a way that other people can maybe use those norms and apply them to their own spaces? Zoning I just talked about. Okay, so access. Also, we have a lot of different types of access for our spaces. So when we have guests coming through, as I mentioned, we have people who are members, people who are coming for events. What qualifies as a resident in that type of space? How are we meant to pay? Like, what should we be paying taxes on? And to what department? Should we be paying taxes for retail stuff? Should we be paying taxes for hotel? Should we be qualifying these people as residents and giving them tenant rights in our spaces? I think we're really interested in finding ways to be compliant with the cities that we're operating in, but it's really rarely very clear how to do that. Inversion, I mentioned, this was actually brought up in the Harvard Design magazine that Eric pointed out, and there's a really great article in it that talked about the ways in which sharing of space kind of inverts public and private. In our spaces, I mean, traditionally you might think of your home as a private space, and when you're outside of your home as being a public space. And similarly as the daytime, when you're out in public and interacting with people, and the evening time or the weekends as when you're kind of retreating away from major social interactions. And in our community, it's sort of exactly the opposite. I do a lot of kind of solo work during the day. And then in the evenings, I come home to a massive dinner of 20 people, half of whom I haven't met before, where I'm making connections about the projects that I'm working on. So it's like social and it's networking. And similarly, the time of day, right? It's the evening, not the daytime. So there's this really there's this question about when do I have private time? How does, again, the architecture support that private time or not? And what is my private space in the broader space of these very fluid physical spaces around me. And then the last one I wanted to mention was governance. So of course we are collectives, we govern things together. So if somebody calls and says, who's the manager, I want to talk to the manager, or you guys aren't following some rule, well, we're all the managers. So again, it brings up questions of compliance. And just a concrete example, we're meant to have a food handler certification for our bed and breakfast license. So who's meant to get that? Who's the manager in that case? And we don't follow the traditional pattern that one person will get that and then disseminate that information to all of their employees, because that's not the way that we're structured. And so how do we have structures internally to make sure that we map onto, and vice versa, the requirements of the city? And this is all just in one city, so I haven't really talked a lot about the network component. And maybe I'll just comment that each of these nuances is very different in all the cities that we're operating in. This doesn't relate to the inversion or the fluidity per se, but I think affordable housing, to kind of one of the motivating factors of this panel, for me this is a really interesting one. In our communities, we kind of have a DIY approach to affordable housing. We get together as a community and we're able to say, well, we'd like to make this room a little bit cheaper and offset that with income from people who are able to afford it. And this isn't going through any kind of bureaucracy, except for the extent to which you consider communal meetings bureaucracy. But it's something that we can decide to do ourselves, and we also don't have to ask permission for it. The flip side is that there's no city policies that would ever recognize what we do as affordable housing, and certainly we would never qualify for any kind of subsidy or support from the city for offering what we do. It's simply because we believe in doing it. Similarly, the spaces that we offer outside of housing, just for events and other things, they're all free. And so, again, it's that kind of a new type of public community space that's supported by pooling of resources in a really interesting way. So I'll just end with a couple of simple hopes and dreams. I think there's very much a don't ask, don't tell thing that goes on with communal housing and all the various externalities of that. There's a lot of great intentions, and I know tons of people in the city who are really trying to support the projects that we are all undertaking. So I don't think it's due to lack of willingness. These are just really complicated systems, and it takes a long time to change them. But if we could get beyond that, maybe through something like a working group with the city where we could actually have a bridge or a channel to communicate these things. There's so many of these spaces that aren't on this panel right now because they don't want to talk about what they're doing and they don't want anybody to know about them. So to be able to channel that information and make space for it before they're in trouble or even bad things are happening because there's no way they could have been compliant would be really excellent. And that's it. I'm going to turn it over. Thanks.
We have Creon Levit, and do you have slides?
I don't have slides, so don't put up that El Capitan again. Okay. So hi. So I promised to not make this an interactive talk, but I do want to start with one question, which maybe if you have children of your own, would you mind raising your hand? Okay, interesting. Thank you. I do not have children. I'm older probably than most of the people in this room, if not all of them. I got married very late in life, just a couple of years ago in my 50s. And so I found myself, actually I just realized for over the last 20 years, living in communal situations. And I don't just mean sharing a flat, I mean communal situations like our previous speakers have been talking about. And I am going to start sort of where I'm going to end the talk. And what I mean by that is, one thing which is starting to weigh on me now is the following. The communal living situations at the Embassy Network and on some of the projects I will describe, and at the houses that Eric was showing examples of, I think this is like a huge growth market for places like San Francisco and other cities that have a lot of young people who aren't yet married and don't yet have children and are maybe actually just out of school where they've been in a communal living situation, dorms and stuff like that. I think that it's like totally unnatural to try to throw those types of people into chopped up subdivided buildings and small little apartments, and then they just go out to bars and stuff like that for their socialization. It's so much more healthy and so much more profound to have communities. But what I'm sort of interested in right now is that's just an obvious match. I mean, if you go out and build these things in a city like San Francisco, people will move into them and they will love them, and I think it will spread, But I'm sort of interested, I know Jessy is too, in a certain sense, of how we might take this to the next level and have things that are more friendly to children of various ages and stuff like that. We know we have the classic co-housing model, which is fairly friendly to that. Several small houses and a few shared common areas. That's sadly all too rare in the Bay Area, much more common in less progressive cities, interestingly enough. But I think there's a whole stretch between the shared houses like in the Embassy Network and classic co-housing. I like to think of the following story. Okay, so in human prehistory, which means for 99% of our existence as humans, we lived in tribal groups, right? They had maybe roughly 50, 100 people in them. And then eventually when we had agriculture and urbanization and stuff like that, we had cities, and they were too big for everybody to be together. So we had villages, we had extended families. That was for most of the rest of human history, right? And then eventually we had actual cities, and so we broke down really into just family groups within the cities, but family then meant, you know, most of your relatives, aunts, uncles, grandparents, grandchildren. And then, of course, I'm not telling you anything you don't know as architecture people, with the invention of the automobile and the invention of the suburb, and, you know, this became what most of our country, unfortunately, thinks is the traditional family, but it's actually not traditional at all, right? You know, the nuclear family, really a very modern invention in the form of with its own house. And then from that, of course, that is unstable. I mean, it just doesn't, it's certainly at variance with the majority of human history. So the nuclear family turned into the single-parent family, and then it turned into the runaway, no-parent people, and, you know, there's nowhere left to go except for back towards a more natural community. And I believe to some extent the communal experiments like Embassy Network and all these houses and the things that I've been doing are striving to get back to this somewhat natural state, or at least take the best of the old and combine it with the best of the new. Now, I'm going to tell you about one particular experiment that I've been doing for a number of years in this area. When I decided to leave my life living in a flat in San Francisco, I was attracted to the houseboats of Sausalito. I don't know how many of you have ever gone up and wandered around the houseboats of Sausalito, but you should. They're a treasure and one of the most interesting pieces of architectural uniqueness in the world, and certainly in California. So go spend a lazy Saturday when it's nice weather walking around all the different houseboat marinas in San Francisco. You'll be pleasantly amazed. Anyway, I was drawn up there, but and it was sort of you know, a lot of the hippies and ex-hippies and outsiders who lived on these crazy houseboats. But I was drawn to like the outsiders. So some friends of mine lived on a giant ferry boat, or a big ferry boat. It was like maybe 8 times as big as this room. And I was fortunate enough to spend a number of years aboard that ferry. I think Jessy's been, I know Jessy's been, actually maybe one of the only ones. Alan Watts used to live there. And it was run sort of as a communal situation. We all took time to help maintain it and things like that. Eventually, I tried to set up communities on ships. And I think that if you've ever studied like Christopher Alexander, like a lot of us amateur architect people kind of do, ships have design patterns all their own that are actually made for community. In a ship, you have these tiny little cabins. You have almost no private space. By ship, I mean a working ship, like a cargo ship or an oil tanker or a ferry boat. You have tiny little cabins that's just enough space to sleep and brush your teeth. And then you have everything else is communal, the workspaces, the dining spaces, the lounging spaces. And so I believe that if you want to figure out how to create workable, economical community spaces for the types of people who would like to live in them, you might want to look at ships and the design patterns which are implicit in the construction and operations of ships. Everyone has to work together, but they need their private space, etc. And also, I would suggest that if you're looking for inexpensive housing stock and a way to do something really revolutionary, you might want to realize that there are literally thousands of ships in this world which are they're not in good enough shape to still be ships, or they're not economical to still run as ships, but they're in perfectly good shape, and it's a tragedy to scrap them. We have cities like San Francisco which have moribund ports and dozens and dozens of docks. Ships could be brought to these docks. The infrastructure is there, although it's somewhat decaying. They can all be hooked up to electricity, sewage, and things like that, which tend to still be at these piers. You can have many, many thousands of units of community-type housing booted up in relatively short order if we really had to do it or wanted to do it. And then, if the demand goes down, or the old piers need to be converted to something that makes more money, the ships can depart and go somewhere else. But I think there's something, I've learned something from this ferry boat and ship experience, and while I'm not saying that architects should necessarily jump on board, I think they might want to study ships and consider naval architecture and consider how to work at this interface between the land and the water and do something along these lines with these entities that were created to hold community within the hull. Thank you.
Great, so first, I actually want to thank Eric and Niraj and Jonathan and Chris for having us here because we're learning so much so quickly, so it's like boot camp for us, which is an improvement on our 9-hour walk around the city yesterday, which was the first phase of this boot camp. But you know, I think just to sort of recap for those who don't know, this is the second time I'm teaching with Pier Vittorio Aureli, a studio on housing in San Francisco at Yale, and it's a topic that is complex, so we decided to keep addressing it for a second year as we learn more and as the work becomes more rigorous and informed. So what I'll show you today is a work in progress, really. This is the work from the first studio that we completed last spring, and it's bits and pieces of it. But you know, to continue sort of the hard sell on communal living, this is a studio where we're looking for new models. So instead of shrinking the typical home, how can we give something more, both learning from San Francisco to create things that are specific to the place, but also thinking about new models that perhaps don't quite exist. And these are purpose-built models, so a little bit different than what you've seen so far, at least in this panel, but that'll become evident. Great. So the place to start is looking at how the city gets subdivided, so focusing on the city center and the grid that starts to define parcels of land and how those dimensions actually start to define the home in San Francisco. So the townhouse variations everyone's familiar with, we looked at those plans, but also things like SROs, and so-called hotels, and courthouses, Otero Terrace here, but also models like the Palace Hotel, which is something that really intrigued us because it has both places for personal space, but that are small and efficient, but then also these generous communal moments where you can really have an expanded life. So in exchange for less personal space, you have this kind of much greater square footage and access and communal activity available to you. And that's something that sort of has gone away. And instead we have things like these Hayes Valley apartments, which you see here, or other models that you know we've already talked about today. So the micro unit on top is the plan of the panoramic, which again is that shrinking. So everything's inside of the same envelope. The kitchen, the bathroom, it's just much smaller. So there might be communal spaces in the building, but it's not necessarily used because you have everything in your unit. Or 20 Mission, which is the plan on the bottom, which has a large communal space in the center, and I believe the corners are also communal there. So a very different type of model. And then we also looked at precedents, and we're continuing to look at actually many more extensive precedents this year. This is Hannes Meyer's Co-op Zimmer, which is a kind of model of the sort of cell, but it doesn't have those things in it like the kitchen and the bathroom, so it suggests that there are other shared things, or there must be for you to live here. So in some ways it's not a model of, you know, it's not a jail cell, it's actually something that's more about freedom. And another model is the Le Corbusier Le Cabanon, which, though more hermetic, starts to suggest, again, that the kitchen is removed, so there's some relationship with the outside, but also ways that we can think about efficiencies, so looking at built-ins and things like that. I'll show you a few things that we're thinking about the city. I think we're learning more and more about opportunities. The sites in red are sites that were flagged by last year's group as potential sites. Many of them are Kirsten's so-called soft sites. Soft sites, yes, which is a great term that I think we'll probably continue to use. Sites that are underdeveloped, so either like one-story retail or parking. With some photos of them. Streets was one, wide streets, extra wide streets that have parking, many lanes of traffic, a center, median, more traffic, more parking, extra wide sidewalks. This is something that our studio looked at as a potential for increasing density. Gas stations, parking lots, empty lots, and here we're looking at a port lot, and the piers. And I will now not describe 9. We did 9 projects in the studio. I've brought 5 of them to show you sort of very quickly so that we don't run out of time. But these are very specific projects, and again, provocations and works in progress. But hopefully related to a lot of the conversation we've had today. So the first is called Court, and it starts with a very simple idea of a wall, essentially, with kind of 3 divisions. And this is something that gets repeated and starts to host beds and desks. And in this kind of repetition, we start to see, hopefully, not only the ability to accommodate different sizes of groups, so the single person or the 2 people, or the ability to expand, but something that's not necessarily geared towards the nuclear family. Here we have a kind of idea where when the bars of the units meet, we get common space, and below that you might have a kind of shared live-work situation on the ground floor. So these start to move together, and by their massing create all different shapes to fit different sites in the city. The next project is called Score, and this looks at the piers, and in a different way than bringing boats to them. But again, this idea of a very simple unit, a wall with some divisions that start to host beds and closets and things like that, and just by their arrangement start to describe personal space, a sort of personal cell here at the top. But then some kind of intermediate shared space that could be for work, and then larger, more generous shared space that could be for eating or parties or things like that. Here, the placement of them starts to suggest kind of no distinct ownership. So it's not like you own your row, but you might have access to sort of different areas. Then again, looking at the sort of economy of sharing and new models of ownership. This one has a complex stacking, and it changes essentially in its massing from one side to the other. So occupying those piers, we have sort of 2 varying facades, not unlike other warehouse architecture that we've seen in piers in the United States. But the experience inside is different, and it has this kind of, again, different types of spaces that could be occupied in different ways, flexibility built in, but also specificity. So I think that's something that's really, for me, been very interesting in these projects, this kind of range going from something that's very specific to allow you to live efficiently to spaces that are actually extremely flexible so that they can accommodate a wide variety of uses and also people. The next idea is Core. And this actually takes just 3 very simple forms. A storage with beds, a bathroom, and a staircase. And when you start to array them in the middle of a space, you get some more private spaces and then larger, longer public spaces. So this is actually looking at a tower form. So you can see here, and I should have mentioned, all of these projects have specific siting as well. So this is a project that envisions the same method using 3 different sightings. So this is the tower form, which might be here, might be appropriate for if there was a site downtown. And again, that's that shared space and the bedroom. Or a kind of more townhouse massing. So these kind of lower rise sites that exist around the city. But again, placing the cores in the middle with private spaces on one end and public spaces on the other. And so we start to get blocks like this here. Or a kind of lower, much lower scale, actually single-story idea that starts to occupy warehouse districts that are sort of low but wide, which might look like this. Palazzina is a type that's a scale of building that we think could be actually very interesting for San Francisco. This is a plan that's maybe not entirely recognizable, but you see that there's sort of bathroom elements and private zones that are interspersed with large, generous public zones. They mass together, you get a kind of complex, but also a very rigorous series of spaces that shift in scale. So you have sort of, again, that efficient zone where you sleep, that's private, and then that large, generous space where you have a variety of opportunities. This one is defined by its core, essentially, and that can start to be amassed in different ways. So this does fit on a lot of city lots, but another option is to actually start seeing this as a low tower form that gets repeated in perhaps a checkerboard grid, maybe on larger sites, potentially that might be at the edge. And so we have this kind of scale that's maybe unfamiliar because it sort of spans sort of 1.5 stories, some of these spaces. And the final is Arcade. So this is a project that looks at collective space a little bit differently. This is one of the projects that looked at the streets. This is looking at wide streets. So the area of study that we looked at was really the corner of the city bordered by 16th Street and Divisadero. So thinking about where there are these sort of wider roadways, could we have either housing that occupies just the parking or another version that occupies the median, maybe taking away the parking. So both versions were drawn. So this is more of a hermetic kind of living situation, but it has underneath a kind of shared working space. So there we are with the wall removed. Or this version, which is really more of like maybe a hotel where you stay for a few nights, and it's on the median, and this is a double loaded version. And the working space is there, and the living space to the last. That's it.
Next we have Zachary.
Hi. So, I only brought a few pictures. I wasn't really prepared for a slideshow, and I'm by far the least academic of all of us on the panel. So, start with talking about how I started. My parents were hippies, and I grew up in a house that had multiple families living in it all the time, and they switched in and out. A lot of times along the lines of like refugees or different crisis areas, like people will be through for like 7 to 10 months, usually back for churches or different programs. So for me, living like in a collective or co-op is very, very easy and pretty second nature, and I've been doing it my entire life. And when most people went away to college, I went through a very long like anarcho hitchhiking phase, and I saw communes all over the country and all over Europe and all over Latin America, and I stayed in like, agricultural-based communes, and I lived in communes that would never call themselves communes, and I stayed in squats or sort of like illegal, like warehouse-based, sort of our landlord neglects this place and now we've taken it, styles of living. I've been involved with like anarchist, like pure anarchist, like we don't really know, we're having rules that are happening in this space that like, if you claim this bedroom, you better put a lock on it, no one's in charge, there's no plenum or like gathering of the minds to like figure out how things work. And then I've also been in anarchist spaces that were very like almost sort of like meeting fetishists, and like, there was like 4 meetings a week to discuss like all of the major things that we all had to agree on in order to live. And so I've seen like every different style of like authoritative group dynamic. Like, so how are we going to make this decision? Like, oh, this one person's in charge, or all 15 of us are in charge. And so I started my own houses. I got over that, felt like I needed to settle down, and I started making my own houses in the late 90s. I founded 8 different community houses, and 3 of them are still in existence, which is really neat because I don't know anyone who lives at any of those houses now, but they're still, like the same built environment is there, they're still going more or less off the same cultural vibe. The last one I started is in Oakland. I started it 2.5 years ago, and there's it's a 6-bedroom house that was subdivided sometime in the like 1950s. So the landlord has it into 2 units, and we rented both of them, and then we rented the sort of the garage and the like driveway next to us. So we've got 2 gardens, 2 kitchens, 2 bathrooms, 6 bedrooms, and a population that stitches between 9 and 15. Not a large amount of pattern. So this is our backyard, and when we started it, it was just this like empty space. And I'm a landscape. I make landscapes for people, and normally everything I do is very controlled and very like museum-y and arty. But because I was going to have all these roommates, we needed something that invited people to feel welcome. So a lot of how we structure our built environment is by sort of inviting some level of visual chaos. And so rather than like, you know what I mean? Because it says like everyone feels welcome here, because it's like, oh, I know exactly where everything isn't. So people go crazy a little bit in my house because there'll be times where you're like, where are the pans? And you're like, well, someone did the dishes and they thought we had a bad system for where the dishes were, so they moved them all. Look around. And then we've had like 15 or 16 different major, concepts of how like the dishes get stacked, or where do the towels get stored, or things like the laundry machine has moved like 5 different times in 2 years because someone decides one morning that they're like, this is not good feng shui for our use, so they move it. Basically, that's like the most important part I want to tell you, is like the practical thing, and that in my experience, that how communes, the most important thing with a commune is actually like the emotional, intentional choice to be in one. And that regardless of what is wrong with the building that you're in, as long as the people have made a choice to become ready to do this sort of thing, then you're gonna be okay. Is that you can work around all sorts of things. I've seen people cut holes in rentals, which is kind of crazy, and like remove studs and do all sorts of like home repair that their landlords would die if they knew. But the most important part really is that people have to choose, and that we don't really come from a culture where there's not a lot of reward for being a communal, that the competition is highly, highly, highly enforced and is rewarded in people, and most people don't have a particularly large skill set around communicating, forgiveness, sort of cutting people slack, accepting that somebody else has a very different sense of ability than you do, and these are the sorts of lessons I feel like communalism is really going to be bringing forward, and especially now that we like live in the age of the internet, and that what I've sort of seen is that people got more like type. They're really not as good at like parties or social situations or meeting somebody in the elevator or handling things like the grocery store. People are all stressed out at the grocery store all of a sudden. It was like, a lot of it is like people have to actually decide, like, okay, everyone else is fine too, and how can I not mess with them, like, as part of my daily life, and how can I sort of like let a lot of things like roll off my back. That when you live alone, or when you live like with just like your nuclear family, you don't have to practice anywhere near as often as just be like, oh, I'm sorry, I was wrong yesterday. Totally ate the last of your milk. I got in a fight with my boyfriend, I kept you up all night long. Whatever it is, like there's like a whole lot of things that happen when you live with people, and you have to be able to sort of like work with people where they're at. So I want to show you guys just the pictures, because this is what it looks like at night. We throw a dinner party every Monday, and so I guess two things are really fascinating about my house is that one is mixed generational. We have 2 men in their 50s, 1 man in their 70s, 3 guys in their 40s, 2 guys in their 30s, and 1 guy in their 20s. That's all men. And we throw dinner parties every Monday, and those are catered by 2 other elders who pay money to stay at our space whenever they want to. They each contribute like $100 a month, but they actually have their own houses and their own like sort of like grown-up, away from us lives with partners or whatever. But they sponsor and cook the dinner, and they utilize that as their sort of like community time for the week, so that they like can schedule in like, oh, now I've got a big family moment. And what's fascinating about it is that the dinners have been going, we've had like almost 150 of them now, so like we've been doing them for exactly 2 years, and people come through and love them and have an amazing time, but there's no RSVP, and so we never know if it's going to be like 30 people at dinner or like 75 people at dinner. And so we've gotten very good at learning how to flex recipes and being like, oh, head count, let's do another rice maker, let's do 3 more rice. It's like you just learn very quickly how to scale things up. But the reason I want to bring up the mixed ages is kind of how we got the place. Is when I got evicted out of San Francisco, this is from our Bernie Sanders, we just sponsored a, what's it called, phone banking. We had like 40 people sitting in my garage calling for politics. So that's like the message board. This is a party that we threw like 3 weeks ago. My garage has, it would be a 3-car garage, and so sometimes it hosts like art studio stuff, and sometimes it's got like drag queens. This is a rapper. They're about to do live beatboxing. They had to move everyone back so they could have break dancers. And the next morning at 9 a.m. we put in a dining room table, and we served like a meal to a nonprofit that needed to have our, like that's being founded right now, because they don't really have space to do meetings, so they did the meeting in our garage. And there was still confetti and glitter everywhere, and we did not take down lights. But the reason I brought up the old people is because when I got evicted from San Francisco, I didn't have any money at all, and it was a really hard time to get it. And so we asked a lot of the elders, like, can we borrow some coins to start up a new commune? And the gay elders, watching how much of the housing crisis was going down, were like, yeah, we'll give you guys 10 grand, but you have to take a pick. There's like 7 men over the age of 70 who've just gotten evicted. You have to take 2 of them. And that's the only way you'll get it. And we took 2 of them, and one of them actually moved on to its own another house because he didn't like living communally. But I think that that to me sort of showed me that intentional communities were really like functioning and working, is that people who were maybe never going to come to our house paid for us to get it because they didn't want somebody else to not have a home. And I think that that's like a particularly awesome testimonial to like what co-living can do for people.
All right, and our final presentation by Jay. Slides all forward. I'll turn it over to Jay.
Thanks. So everyone pretty much already described co-living, community living of various different flavors, so I'll skip this part. So Open Door creates co-living houses. We have 3 in the East Bay. And the upper left is the farmhouse, which was our first project. Is a master lease of an old Victorian farmhouse. It's 16 bedrooms. So what do you do with a 16-bedroom house? Most people don't have that many kids. This is Euclid Manor, built in 1910. The most recent house of ours, sort of a master lease, sort of a partnership with an investment group. And then not pictured is a house called Canopy, which we bought in Oakland and renovated and shifted around the kitchen and living space from 2 4-bedroom apartments, and opened one of the kitchens up, moved some bedrooms around, and created a real communal living and dining space. So we are kind of like the Intel inside of community living. So we create real spaces for real people, but we do a lot of the heavy lifting that is a gargantuan effort for a group of people to come together. The 10 grand being a good example of like, how do you get the house to begin with is a huge barrier, especially when we're talking about properties that are 5 times the size of a normal apartment. More pictures of just stuff and people and dinners and poetry slams and whatnot. Already went through the houses. So what we found in the process of trying to start these houses is that there's a limited supply of 16-bedroom Victorian farmhouses that are perfect for communal living. So, right, developers are mostly building studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and maybe some 3 bedrooms. And the way that a project design is like, what's your unit mix of 1, 2s, and 3s? We're like, how about some 9s in there? Actually, Jessy and I consulted with a developer called Build Inc. in San Francisco for a project called 1532 Harrison, which was going to be a co-living apartment building, and for various reasons didn't happen and turned into a traditional project. But this was the layout of sort of basically micro suites or en suites or efficiencies that had their own bathroom and sort of kitchenette with a nice grand living space, dining, kitchen shared in the center. And so this would be considered in San Francisco's group housing code. So this would be 1 unit. And roughly sort of 30% common space. Our houses have about 50% common space. I don't know what your house is. Yeah, it's pretty
not a
high.
competition, guys.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Well, we're very we're like cousins or something like that. We all spun out of each other's work. So this is sort of the basic geometry and logic and finances of how co-living compares to traditional apartments. So on the left, you have sort of your, we'll simplify units and say it's a 500 square foot apartment for $1,000. The light green is your living space, so your kitchen, dining, living room within your unit. So you have access to 500 square feet and you pay $1,000. On the right, you have the same floor plate but divided and added 2 more bedrooms, but you're taking all your shared living space and combining it. So each resident has access to a much larger area than they would in a traditional apartment, but they're paying nominally less than they would for the apartment. So from their perspective, it's like, cool, I'm paying $850 instead of $1,000, and I have this baller living room and great kitchen and amazing people to live with. Like, that's a pretty cool opportunity. And so on the, I don't know, maybe I didn't put the last slide, but what that spits out from a financial perspective is the total rents are actually higher for the co-living unit. So from a development perspective, it makes sense. Now, when we go into have these like meetings with developers and investors and stuff, they're like, well, tell me about this newfangled hippie commune thing, and I don't know about that. No one's ever done that before. And we're like, actually, people are doing it all the time. We've lived like this for hundreds of years, and it's actually a new thing that we have the nuclear family with like 2 people living together. That's not a natural human existence. So some of the things that we find ourselves kind of figuring out as we go along, as we begin to pitch this idea to developers, and we're starting to get a lot of traction with the idea of building new housing that takes the co-living typology. Banks are a big question, so we have real conversations with developers and the equity investors that are behind them, and they're like, cool, we generally get it, you guys are starting to have a track record, there's other people doing this, it's starting to make sense. The banks are even more conservative than we are. So now there's this effort of like, okay, we're gonna like put this master lease down, and we're going to have guarantors for the master lease, and we're going to have a bond and all this stuff so that the bank can take zero risk and we can take all the risk. And that'll be like that for a while, and then it'll become more standard, and that's how these kinds of innovations kind of slowly become normal. And then also the other risk is in the unit type, and they're saying, well, if this is a fad, it needs to reverse back into traditional apartments. So we work a lot on looking at the floor plate and where the utility stacks and the plumbing stacks are, and figuring out how to lay out our units and our rooms such that you have soft walls and stuff like that, and it all can be reversed back to traditional apartments. And you figure out the cost of that, and you say that's the risk, and so it's playing a lot of puzzles with the space and all the different risks that you're taking on. But a final one is the zoning question. So we've basically just taken the existing zoning and either had multiple units or had grandfathered in places like the farmhouse that are these old 16-bedroom houses. But eventually it would be great, and we've spoken a little bit about the idea of creating a co-living use type in the zoning code that says you can have a 10-bedroom unit, and this is how you deal with parking, and this is how you deal with neighborhood interactions and which zones it can be in and stuff like that. Because parking is ultimately one of the biggest things that you will always have to deal with. We spend a lot of money housing cars in buildings and cities. A two-story podium costs like 30% of the building cost. So as architects, the more that architecture, creative people can get into the hands of being themselves developers and not being hired by the developers, you guys have all the skills that are really required to do development, and it's just a matter of adding an additional hat called talking to equity investors and figuring out risk. So I would encourage all of you guys to not just be hired by developers, but to become them.
So that concludes our panelists' presentations. We're at 6:30, which I believe means that we're done, but take a few questions. How about that? Does anyone have some burning questions that they must ask? Why don't we start with Serena?
Yeah, so I just wanted to touch on the idea that you talked about at the beginning about the family being a pocket of communism that supported capitalism. And I guess my quick question is, how do we stop communes replicating that?
How we stop communes? Sorry, can you repeat that?
Replicating the sort of unpaid labor of the family. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a term for that. It's called primitive accumulation in the sort of Marxian lexicon. And I guess the fact is, I don't know that we can, and I'm not sure that a lot of people would like to, and I would imagine there's a diversity of perspectives on this. So for me, I'm interested in thinking about how some of us might, but I would turn it over to other people for thinking about the question.
I was actually kind of noodling on this, and one thought, I don't know if it's an answer by any means, but one thought was that one thing, what communes also do is collectivize public space, as we were talking about, and I think that one of the powers in collectivizing public space is that we can ask different questions. So there's a certain, whether it's implicit or explicit, there are certain things we have permission to ask in existing public spaces, like certain ways of being that are okay or not okay. Certain salons or discussion topics that would be acceptable in, say, like the Jewish Community Center versus the Embassy Community Center. And so, that's not really a great answer, but it's redefining the permission space of the ways in which we come together can at least make room to ask that question and to answer it in a different way.
Yeah. Actually, I should just quickly tell an anecdote about, so I went for dinner at Zach's Radical Fairy House in Oakland, and I was one of 2 women in a house full of 25 men, and at the end of dinner I got up to do the dishes, and Zach stopped me and said, no, women don't do dishes in my house. And so there are interesting examples of culture creation, I think.
Does anyone else want to take a stab at that question?
I guess I just want to say that to answer that is, well, one, that is a true thing in our house because there are so many boys running around that we have to enforce feminism. We have to be like, hey pay attention to how you are acting in the world, because otherwise we don't have enough girlfriends kind of reminding us, unlike you would in a more mixed gendered environment. And then the other thing that we found is that our rule is like give as you are able and as joyful. And so like the work, while it's like you're never gonna get paid for doing the dishes, you're never gonna get paid for like cleaning the windows, but it's better to just do the work as long as it feels nice to you, rather than be annoyed that it's not being done. And so that's one of the ways that we try and sort of change the economy around who does what work.
I hope we don't lose track of this, the fact that even if the labor is done for free, it has this multiplier effect. Like when I fix something on the ship, many people benefit from it. And when I fix something at my apartment, not very many people benefit.
So giving maybe a new value, a cultural value to domestic labor, perhaps is a good answer to that question.
Yeah.
Any more questions here, Victoria?
Yeah, actually, maybe a question that I found maybe kind of provocation is the link between, one hand, the political economy. I really appreciate that in most of your presentations, you really went to the pragmatics of the community. Because I think one way in which as Eric was saying, the ethos of the commune is being appropriated by mainstream culture is really to idealize the commune as this kind of idea of sharing, the sharing economy. And I think that what I found really interesting in your presentations that you really went to the nitty-gritty, to the struggle actually, which is, I think, very, very important. But I think there is also an aesthetic issue. I think the movements you mentioned at the beginning, the autonomia movement, that, the century sociality that it produced, it was also using very specific aesthetic forms, music, culture, art, that was very specific, and it was really trying to basically develop a gap between those communes and the rest of society. Actually, looking to some of your images, I know that might sound a very trivial remark, but some of the images you showed about your communes, I think that this would be like the wet dream of any developers, to have this kind of very cozy coffee shop atmosphere, this kind of lounge, and I wonder whether you are thinking about that, because actually this is actually how gentrification starts. And I wonder how, in regards to your idea of self-valorization, how you actually make sure that what you're doing in a way is not, potentially gentrifying the places in which you start these communes.
That's it.
Yeah, something we didn't get a chance to talk to is about ownership, which I think is the next phase of all of this. As we create the operating model, we distill the way of like running and starting spaces, and there's a clear culture and a way of being. The next phase is how do we begin to collectively own these spaces, which I think will more deeply address the gentrification question than anything else. And also the financing structures that are required for 10 people to own a house together can also be applied to how do 10 medium income people own a property together in their neighborhood such that everyone is participating in the economic growth that's happening versus getting pushed out. And that's not the only solution, but I think it's an important one because otherwise you just see large investors who are able to pay higher prices for things and benefit from growth of the neighborhood. So
I think it's a really interesting point, and in San Francisco right now, as I'm sure is happening in many other cities, the micro units are, I think, in danger of becoming, a kind of commoditization of a kind of a hack of existing, housing stock that people used to utilize to make places more affordable. If you've been around for a little while, you might remember live-work lofts in San Francisco, which was, a very similar tale where, changes were made to, zoning and building code laws to allow people to have these, loft spaces and no parking. And lo and behold, developers loved them. They were, really happy to build, more units with no parking and lower costs. And you know, and as a spatial type, they proliferated all over the city until there was a moratorium put on them. But, you know, I think it's just a cautionary tale in terms of, you know, how, you know, on the one hand, it's really important that the architecture facilitates this form of living, but at the same time, you know, how does it not become commoditized?
Could I maybe just, because I guess I'm curious from you guys who have experiences living in various forms of experiments, how much does it allow you in your day-to-day to kind of sit outside the systems of capital? Because I think that was sort of where Eric started, and I guess if it allows you maybe to sit outside those systems.
No, it does the exact opposite. I mean, if you're going to try and run a community, you know, capital is a starting requirement, and capital is always an issue with you. You have to run your spreadsheets, and you know, it's weird. It's like you're a landlord, but you don't own the property. That's a pretty common thing, I think, among some of these players here, and so it's really important. In my perspective, I want to say one quick thing about ownership, which is that I totally agree. I think that is the next frontier. I think it's a frontier also as the community, as the communes. I don't really like to call them that. Move from young singles to more successful, more mature, more starting families and stuff like that. There's a real opportunity there, and also, of course, owners. I mean, it's just a different mentality, right? If you're renting a place, I don't care whether it's a commune or not. If you're renting a place and you put a big gouge in the floor, you're just going to put the rug over it, you know. And if you own it, you're going to think about fixing it. In general. Lastly, I want to say, and this is something for the architects. I solicit opinion on this. Cars, parking. Are we kind of like shutting the barn door after the cars have left with the rise of ride sharing and stuff like that? Like, are we going to build more skyscrapers with 30% of the money put into parking garages that remain empty? I just moved into an apartment with a parking garage, and there's no way I'm renting a parking space.